Hey guys, it's your Peacekeeper coming at you with the next video in our How to Play series on the US Cruiser line. This is, yes, the Tier 1 Erie class of cruisers. And before you all get your panties in a wad over me doing a video on the Erie, understand that we're just going to briefly cover this. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about how this ship plays. The battle video, I'm actually going to spend most of the time talking about how the U.S. cruisers at the long term play as opposed to just the Erie. Let's dive on into the history though. The Erie class is a gunboat that was the product of extensive lobbying from the U.S. Naval Advisor, Admiral William Pratt, to the nations participating in the London Naval Treaty Conference of 1930. He argued that a class of ships, no more than 2,000 long tons in displacement, no torpedoes, with the max speed of 20 knots, and up to 4 guns from 3.1 inches to 6.1 inches should be allowed to be built without any restrictions under the London Naval Treaty. The nations who were participating in this conference all agreed, and as a result, work began on the Erie-class gunboat. 2 of these ships were built, PG-50, which is the USS Erie, and PG-51, which is the USS Charleston, and both served from 1936 to 1945 with the U.S. Navy. Both of these ships were used extensively on ambassador missions to various countries and to protect U.S. interests abroad. The Erie participated in the Spanish Civil War, protecting U.S. interests abroad. And at the onset of World War II, the Erie was stationed in the Pacific end of the Panama Canal. She would be sunk while escorting a convoy to Guantanamo Bay from Port of Spain and Trinidad. She took a submarine-launched torpedo to her stern, but was able to keep the ship afloat long enough, as well as moving forward, to beach it 100 yards from shore. Several explosions in the ready rooms for the main guns killed or injured several crew members, but the Erie was in good enough condition to be salvaged and was taken back to the States for scrapping. When back in the States, she actually capsized in her moorings and was left there until 1952. And in 1952, they would raise her up and tow her out to deeper waters and sink her again. The USS Charleston was stationed in Dutch Harbor at the onset of World War II. She would participate in the recapturing of Attu Island that was invaded by the Japanese at the same time as Pearl Harbor. And during that, her assistance at Attu, she evaded several airplane-dropped torpedoes. In 1945, at the end of the war, she sailed to Hong Kong and Shanghai for diplomatic duties, and when she was done with those, she sailed back to San Francisco for further decommissioning. She remained a training ship at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy until 1959, when she was turned back over to the U.S. Maritime Administration for final disposition. In terms of her in-game play style, like all the other Tier 1 cruisers with the exception of the Black Swan, she only fires HE. And unfortunately, that is a huge disadvantage because having 6-inch guns, she's kind of held back with her HE. Not because HE isn't effective, but because the AP rounds that she had prior to the AP being removed was very potent, and it made the ship a lot of fun to play because you catch a ship broadside and it was almost a guaranteed citadel. Now with the HE and the relatively poor accuracy, her gunplay isn't that good. However, she is a particularly hardy ship and can take quite a punishment. She is also relatively maneuverable and reasonably quick for a Tier 1 cruiser, and I think that really helps her out a lot. Let's dive on into those stats. In terms of hit points, she has 4,950. Her main battery consists of 4 single 6-inch guns of 47 caliber in length with a 9.6 kilometer range and a reload of 7 seconds. She does have AA guns. These are the 1.1-inch Chicago pianos. However, at Tier 1, she's not going to actually see any aircraft for that to matter. Her max speed is 20 knots, a turning circle of 300 meters, and a rudder shift time of 2.8 seconds. Her detection range by sea is 8.3 kilometers without any camo, and 5.8 by air. In terms of the upgrade slot, there is only one. Main Armaments Mod 1. There can be only one. That, I think, is by far the best skill for this, although, truthfully, at Tier 1, it really doesn't matter. You can't use premium consumables. You can use flags and you can use camo, but beyond that, it's, your time in Erie is so short, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, let's dive on into the battle video, and we'll get to chatting about how the U.S. cruisers are overall, especially in the long term once we get closer to Tier 10. Alright, so obviously this battle is going to be a Tier 1 battle, but one of the things that briefly I want to talk about is that, with the lack of AP on this ship, it has really been hard for Erie to do well at Tier 1, and I'm glad to see that Wargaming in the upcoming patch, this video will probably hit as patch 6.1 is coming out, and in that patch they are buffing the rate of fire by a full second, so from 7 seconds down to 6 seconds, and that really is nice. I mean, I'm glad that they are finally deciding to buff the ship, but really what killed this ship was the fact that you can't use AP in it anymore, and I think that ultimately is what the downside of it was. And Tier 1 doesn't show it very well, but we'll start to see this coming up in later tiers, and I don't mean to get on this soapbox of, well, the US Navy sucks, blah, 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 but this game has perpetually put several of the US Navy ships at a lower place than the corresponding nations. The U.S. cruiser line is particularly Dev Strike Detonation. The U.S. Navy cruiser line has always been kind of the black sheep. Like, it has some very big strengths, don't get me wrong. The armor-piercing rounds on U.S. cruisers is very impressive, and it's certainly nothing to sneeze at. But that said, there's only the Pensacola, New Orleans, Baltimore, and Des Moines that get any benefit from better auto bounce angles. And the Cleveland is the only other ship that shoots a, quote, super heavy shell for its caliber, and all of them do have increased penetration capabilities, but the problem and the downside to this is that they are almost always matched with a gun arc that is really hard to hit with at range, and the ships lack the torpedoes to really get in and brawl up close and personal. And so it puts these ships in a really awkward position because you get to like the Tier 10 Des Moines, which is this rate of fire monster. Everybody's like, it's so strong, it's got so much rate of fire, and Wargaming is buffing that, by the way. But the rate of fire is so high, it couldn't possibly be bad, but I find myself getting very frustrated because the one area that I would expect that ship would perform really well in are those close-in engagements, and they've been pushed out of that location by the Royal Navy cruisers, by the German cruisers, and they lack the, utility, accuracy, and gun arcs to really fire at longer ranges like the Russians and the Japanese do. And yes, they have very strong anti-aircraft capabilities, and that there should be nothing that takes that away from them. And for the most part, their AA duties are quite good. However, there's no carriers in the game at the moment. So again, we have kind of a lack of value for U.S. cruisers at the higher tiers because of it. And so with all of that in mind, what's the role? Well, I'm not sure that there really is a role. The ships are kind of generalists, and they seem to do everything okay, but nothing real strong. And that really leaves me kind of frustrated because of the way that the game currently plays out. The other nations all have something that they're really strong with. The Japanese have torpedoes and they have high explosive. The Russians have high explosive and lasers practically, as well as very trollish bow armor that is hard to get through with just about anything. The Royal Navy has concealment, and they have rate of fire, and they have this stupid special AP round that just law pens all the things just as good as the 8-inch shells do, but with super short fuse time so that they don't have to worry about over-penning damage, and there's just a lot of advantages to the other cruiser lines. Now the Germans are the next closest analog that we have to a US, counterpart that's even comparable. And you start to look at some of the things that the Germans really struggle in or supposedly struggle in. and they're really not that bad. They've got a really good armor profile that gives them, makes them very hard to citadel at close ranges by cruisers, and to an extent to battleships too. So it's not like they're complete loss there, but it leaves you to wonder, well, what does the U.S. get aside from anti-aircraft? Because right now that's really not a skill, and like the battleships, it's not enough to offset all of the other downsides that the ships have. And that's not to say the ships can't post great games. I've had dozens of great games and ships that people say are just downright terrible. Baltimore, I've had several 100,000 damage plus games where I've got multiple sinks. I think I got a Kraken in the New Orleans once. I mean, the ships can do some pretty impressive things, but really their problem comes from the lack of utility. Outside of their role as gunboats, they don't have anything to offset that. All the other nations get torpedoes in some form, or they get, some stupid special ability like the Moskva, which doesn't have any torpedoes, but if you point the bow at anything, you'll never take any damage, and your 9.5-inch guns, or however big they are basically rail guns that can't miss. I mean, and they start fires every other time you shoot them. And so it leaves you kind of with that bad taste in your mouth, like, man, it would sure be nice if I could actually do something with these cruisers. And the buffs that Wargaming is doing, I welcome them. So by no means am I complaining that they are buffing U.S. cruisers, but I think that they're looking in the wrong place. The United States, the big thing with the U.S. Navy was always survivability. That was always the strong suit of the U.S. Navy. There are some ships, including the Erie, that had taken huge amounts of damage, remained afloat long enough to get their crews on board or to get them in a position where they're salvageable. I think that what Wargaming could have and should have done with these is either remove the citadels from remove the magazines from the citadels on the 8-inch gun cruisers like they did with the 6-inch gun cruisers, or to buff the hull and bow armor to bounce when angled, mind you, to bounce caliber, that tier's battleship shells caliber. So like for the instance, the Des Moines, if you buff the hull and bow armor to 30 millimeters, they can safely bounce a 16-inch shell when angled. That would give them the survivability that I think they need to really push and to utilize their rate of fire, utilize their fast hurt traverse, their good handling, to really get in and duke it out with some of these other nations' cruisers, because right now there's really nothing about the Des Moines that just wows me. Like, yeah, it's got a great rate of fire, and it's got just absolutely ridiculous anti-aircraft for like the 4 battles every month that you'll run into a carrier. And while that's nice, and I'm not going to complain about it, it's far from a skill that is useful. Well, you've got the longest duration radar in the game. True. And there's not much I can do to take that away, except for the fact that, well, I have to get within, 9.8K to use the thing, and at 9.8K from the nearest destroyer is usually about 12 to 15K from the nearest battleship, and I accept citadels from any angle from him. Yeah, that's not a good trade-off. Like, I would be content there if I could, angle my ship to give me the ability to mitigate that damage. I would be content with the loss of torpedoes. Heck, I'd be content with even an AA nerf, or even that rate of fire going back to where it currently is, to compensate for that. But unfortunately, that's not the case. That's not what they're doing. I'm looking forward to seeing what the ships are capable of post-buff, but I'm not holding my breath for, super amazing gameplay from these cruisers at the high tier, which is really sad because as we'll talk in the history of the Baltimore, the Baltimores were considered to be the single best heavy cruiser design of World War II. And to add to that, the Baltimores were a heavily modified Brooklyn, basically. They used the same hull configuration as the Brooklyns. They had on top of that whole configuration, they used a lot of the compartmentalization, the internal structure work. They were different. They were larger, so that they're not exactly the same. But for the most part, they were heavily influenced by the the Brooklyn's design. And the Brooklyn was a fantastic ship for a treaty cruiser, too. Especially for a 6-inch gun cruiser with the 15-inch guns, as well as being well protected for a ship that had those guns. And that's not represented in the game. Well, the Brooklyn's not represented in the game at all, but that's not represented in the game. You know, we don't have the durability of those ships. We don't have the history. We don't have the capabilities of those ships really all that well explored or even represented. In the Erie is kind of the crux of that. You know, you usually get a pretty good idea of what the Tier 10 cruiser is like playing the Tier 1. And that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but think about that for a minute. You've got the Black Swan, which is the Royal Navy cruiser, has this ridiculous rate of fire, good maneuverability, usable range, usable stealth. That's exactly what the Minotaur is. You know, you've got the Hashidate, which has screaming HE, but is relatively soft on the broadside. There's no torpedoes yet, but it's a very capable ship because the HE alpha is way up there. That's the Zhao in a nutshell. The Orlan has just, again, lawtastic HE with railguns, high rate of fire, very long range, very good when bow on, but really bad when broadside. That's the Mazvka. And you can do this for the Hindenburg with the Hermelin as well. And it just goes to show, like, the Erie does feel like a Des Moines. It feels like it's underperforming, and I don't really care for the way the ship plays. The Des Moines, and for the most part, in spite of all the good things, the Erie has the one thing missing from it that makes the Des Moines so good, and that's the AP. And I wish they'd bring that back. But at the end of the day, like I said, it feels bland. It feels boring. It doesn't have a whole lot of utility to it. That just makes me go, you know, I want to play my Des Moines today. Which is interesting because my Des Moines is my only ship that has a 19-point captain on it. And, you know, I don't know of any other way to say it, guys. I just not really a big fan of the way that the U.S. cruisers play. I think that they do need some help to make them more fun. And I hope that Wargaming, I hope this rate of fire buff helps some of the ships that were in serious need. I know the concealment buff on Pensacola is absolutely necessary and a very, very, very good buff for it. But ultimately, though, gameplay-wise, the U.S. cruisers all play relatively the same. It doesn't matter if you're in a 6-inch gunned Omaha or if you're in the 8-inch gun Baltimore or Des Moines. You want to use islands to your advantage. You absolutely, positively have to use those islands to hide, to get close to your enemies enough to do kind of hit-and-run attacks. Similar to the way the Royal Navy cruiser line does it, but without the advantages that the Royal Navy cruiser line has with its smoke and its heel at the earlier tiers. And the lack of torpedoes really hurts these ships as well. And that's not to say that, you know, the torpedoes are necessary, but you lose them at tier 6 with the Cleveland, which is already nerfed from its real perspective anyway. And AA simply isn't worth it anymore in terms of balancing decisions. I want something more, Wargaming. Give us something more. So on top of using islands for cover, these ships all have very good maneuverability, very tight turning circles with fast rudder shift times. And I think the Baltimore, with both rudder shift modules, gets down to like 3.8 seconds for 180 degree rudder shift time. Stop and think about that number for a minute. There are destroyers in this game that have less or slower rudder shifts than the Baltimore does with the double rudder upgrade. Except for you're in a, 14,000 ton heavy cruiser bearing down on an enemy ship. And that has some fun times, and playing in islands, playing up close, it is a lot of fun to really take advantage of that. And Baltimore also has a really good turning radius to go with it, whereas Des Moines kind of opens both of those stats up a little bit. And so, yeah, playing the U.S. cruisers, the Cleveland is a lot of fun. The Omaha can be fun, although I'm sure the matchmaking has ruined her. The Phoenix is a lot of fun in my experience. The St. Louis is a pretty good ship. The Pensacola, and I'm going to draw some flack for this. I found the Pensacola to be one of the more fun heavy cruisers in the U.S. cruiser line. The ship that I didn't find fun was New Orleans. New Orleans was painful, and it was painful for a multitude of reasons that we can cover later. But for the most part, the line is distinctly average, and if you're wanting to go up the U.S. cruiser line, just keep that in mind. Don't have unrealistic expectations of what the ships can and cannot do, and use them as they were intended to be used, I guess, in this game, as primarily as support ships. And I don't really care for that role. I wish they had a little bit more utility to be more aggressive, but, you know, Wargaming doesn't want to give it to us, at least not at this point. So hopefully the rate of fire buffs, the concealment buffs, will make these ships worth playing full-time, and I look forward to the patch, and I can't wait for it to get here. So, anyway, I think that that's going to kind of clue you in as to the tone of this How to Play series. Unlike some of the other ones where I was legitimately impressed with the way the line played out, you know, like the Royal Navy Cruiser line. It starts off really slow. It starts off with some very good learning tools, and then puts you into some really powerful ships that, if you don't play them right, will punish you. The U.S. battleship line is another line that's very similar to that, where if you play the U.S. battleships right, they are an absolute riot to play. If you play them wrong, they are absolutely awful to play. And the U.S. cruisers just don't have that. I mean, it's a pretty bland progression. I think power creep is an appropriate way to describe what's happened to them. And yeah, I don't know of anything else really to say aside from I'm not real pleased with the way that the U.S. cruiser line played. And for the record, this isn't tainted by closed beta or open beta grumblings. In closed beta, I only got up to the Cleveland. I might have played a game or two in the Pensacola, but for the most part didn't really play it. In open beta, all the way up until really about the end of November, I hadn't played a single U.S. cruiser past Cleveland with any real enthusiasm. Again, I think I had maybe 10 games in the Pensacola, hated it, and decided, nope, we're going back to the Cleveland. We're just going to keep the Cleveland and be done with it. Now that I've had the opportunity to grind through the line, for the record, I ground through New Orleans, Pensacola, and Baltimore to get to the Des Moines. I think I spent all of 10,000 free XP to go from Baltimore to Des Moines because I wanted to get to the Des Moines fast and get some good videos in from it. So I understand how the grind of this line goes, and I get the frustration, guys. I get the frustration. It is real. And as you can see here, I'm trying to kill this Hermit before he kills me. And we don't quite get there, but the U.S. cruiser line, you know, I hope that they buff it some more. I hope they give it some utility, much needed utility, and I hope that it becomes a series of ships worth playing more frequently. Unfortunately, I don't hold my breath for that. And 4 sinks in an Erie, one of which was a devastating strike first blood detonation on, I think it was a Hermelin that I detonated at the very beginning of the match. And our poor Black Swan is all that is left with 1:36 to go on this match. But if you guys have any other observations about the U.S. cruiser line, you know, go ahead and throw them down in the comments. I definitely look forward to hearing from you guys what your guys' opinion are of the various U.S. cruisers and, you know, their play style and whether or not that it's worth actually pursuing this line if you're new. I certainly don't recommend the U.S. cruiser line as the first cruiser line you go down. I think the better cruiser line to go down is going to be the Japanese line. It has far less turds in the punch bowl, for lack of a better phrase, in the sense that all the ships that are bad, like the Furutaka, have had either buffs or aren't nearly as bad as they were in closed and open beta. The U.S. cruisers have kind of remained stagnant. You know, New Orleans got a little bit of an armor change. Well, I guess it was a buff, but it doesn't feel like that ship is any more durable, and that's part of my gripe with the U.S. cruiser line is none of these ships feel particularly durable, and they don't have anything else really to offset that aside from, AA. And at Tier 7 and at Tier 8, the anti-aircraft isn't anything to write home about anyway. In fact, I think the stats... Well, obviously the Royal Navy cruisers are shooting down more aircraft, but the I want to say that the German cruisers actually outdo them in AA at those tiers, which isn't all that surprising given what the anti-aircraft is based on at those tiers. I do look forward to a U.S. cruiser line split. And I hope that happens where we get Brooklyn at tier 6, St. Louis at 7, Cleveland at 8, Fargo at 9, and Worcester at 10. But many people think a different tree would be more useful. But anyway, guys, I look forward to going through this. You know, the next video is going to be another Debbie Downer with the Chester because it's a terrible ship. But stay tuned for more, and as with always, guys, like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for watching.